So blue pill or red pill? Okay, so this is not your typical disclaimer, but it's still important that you realise today that I will be sharing some uncomfortable truths about our sector. I'll be highlighting some examples of some plants that aren't operating as efficiently as they could be, of plant software that's being used which is as old and redundant as Microsoft Paperclip, of non-compliance, of misinformation, and much, much more. So strap yourself in, it's time to make a choice. Okay, this may seem a little dramatic, but the red pill, blue pill analogy is actually very representative of what it's like to be involved in digital transformation in our industry. In fact, I'd probably bet all industries. For those of you, like a couple of my friends, that aren't familiar with the 1999 movie The Matrix, the character Morpheus gives Neo a choice, and the quote goes a little something like this. You take the blue pill, the story ends, you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep this rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. The key driver for going digital is really to provide accessibility, context, and transparency to data. This is so we as a team can use that data to make better decisions. Now, consider the fact that within our industry, the data that is used to measure a plant's performance is often calculated and reported by that plant, and they have complete control over what data is used and how it is used. They can also deny access of that data to anybody else. So there is absolutely no governance frameworks in place. Resistance to change in the digital sense is really just resistance to transparency and the fear of losing control over what data is reported. Transparency creates accountability for results, which can currently be altered discreetly to make a result more palatable. To make matters worse, the same plant is often the sign-off authority for any audit. So the auditee is actually signing off on the auditor for the auditor to be paid. So why on earth would you ever take the red pill, right? Okay, so what does it mean to go digital? Now, I apologise for going over some old ground here, but before we go any further, it is important that we're all on the same page of what digital means. In my experience, most discussions about digital transformations get hijacked by some of the following topics, which are not digital. I'm not here to name names. It's just important to draw the distinction, even if it is to appease my own frustrations. So digital is not about big robot trucks. Inevitably, these get brought up in every conversation about the digital mine. I prefer to refer to these as automation technology. Sure, they generate data, but so do the old non-robot ones. I also appreciate the difference between robot trucks and alien robotic species. It was just an easy visual. Digital is also not about selectively mining with a swarm of nanobot digger drones to the extent where the mine product is equivalent to concentrate grades, eliminating concentrator, hydromet technology, and human involvement in one fell swoop. Will it happen in our lifetime? Probably not, but it is sure fun to talk about over a couple of beverages. Digital is also not about new sensors. Now, I love new sensors, and the range is expanding and the relative cost is actually dropping. This is allowing us to install not only what we need to fundamentally control the plant, but also now install instruments that can measure things we can't control directly, but give us greater insight. Huge fan, the biggest fan. But that's sensor technology. Okay, now that we've covered that, digital is about data and how that can be turned into information. In truth, this is actually often an uncomfortable conversation, and I can see why someone would prefer to talk about big robot trucks and digger drones. People that know me will know that I always refer to going digital as a contact sport. Regardless of what people say on the record, transparency is not popular, and because it changes the fundamentals of how people do their work and the control that they have over how their work is reported. Okay, a little bit of a quick technology slide. So transforming data into information is by no means a simple process. When we talk about going digital, it's important to address the sheer scope of the domain and that each of the components required to deliver the benefits is actually in a different phase of its life cycle and on the innovation landscapes. So I've just provided a high-level diagram. Okay, so if we take it, for example, data is generated in most cases at a sensor, field or lab, and this is really where the digital journey begins. So data capture and storage systems like historians are really well defined, and there are some really excellent products on the market available now. And in fact, they've been available for decades. But that really is only one part of the journey. The journey is actually over before it even begins if there's not appropriate network infrastructure in place. And once again, network infrastructure is constantly evolving and getting better, but the technology as a whole has actually existed for some time. So it really places these technologies in the sustaining innovation quadrant. So they're progressively, or mostly in that quadrant. Interestingly though, we actually still see operating plants that have no data capture storage and inappropriate network infrastructure. Now, if we skip ahead to consider decision support solutions and analytics, this is where the problems are really well understood, but the means to solve the problem are not well defined. So this really places them in the breakthrough quadrant, and this is what I'd like to talk a little bit more about now. Now, I feel like I'm also going to be repeating some of Barry's comments here, but measured data alone is limited in its use and scope. We need to combine it with all the other information to build the detailed picture, or to be more precise, to add context. Now, the key to address in analytics is how to best create that context. So this is where the digital twin comes into play. So twinning, as it's sometimes referred to these days, is actually just the use of simulation. And this has been a core technology in our industry for some time now. Lately, I feel the marketing people are having maybe a little bit too much fun naming digital concepts. For example, we have digital twins, we have digital shadows, we have digital triplets, and so on. I'm actually going to try and coin the phrase digital guinea pig. I hate missing out on the fun. But these are actually just all forms of simulation. So when we start talking about twinning to create context, for a real plant, what we're really talking about is actually the use of dynamic simulation, which is a simulation that includes time as the dimension. Now, this is so we can actually track the flows in a plant, whether they were measured or not. We can analyse the time lag dependency of the process, and I'll give you a quick example. When people look at recovery of a plant, they will often look at the tails and the feed, and they will look at that and determine the recovery. The thing about that is what's in the tails now is actually what they put into the plant 2 days ago. So relating what happened to the tails and the feed at that point in time actually means nothing. You need to take into consideration the journey that the particle has taken in order to get there and how long it's actually taken to get there. We can also track inventory. So you can model all the tanks and their volumes and residence time. You can actually track the detailed chemistry. In the digital twin as well, you can also check reagent receipts versus the storage tank levels versus the flow meters versus the actual chemistry to determine if you're doing it correctly. You can also validate mill-mine reconciliations on a small time block, which is kind of important. And you all do this in one model connected directly to source data. So anyone want to have a guess at when we deployed our first digital twin linked to source data? So back in 2011, we released a digital twin of the Langer Heinrich uranium mine. Anyone want to have a guess at how many measure points were in this solution? Now, just to give you I guess a bit of a definition of measure points, that's how many points in the process that the digital twin did a calculation to give you a result. 16,583 for every minute step. And actually, in order to create those calculations, there's probably at least a couple of 100,000 on top of that. So this is the scale in which the digital twins are available. So I've heard a lot of people talking about digital twins are coming. They're already here. And they're the locations that we've installed them. Context. I need to go into one of these slides because a lot of the time we talk about the context of data, but we never really get into the details of how to do it. So what I actually want to do is give you a real example of how you can use context from a digital twin to come up with a result. So the data you see here is actually real plant data. So to give you a brief description of the graph, so this y-axis is actually what's being measured in the plant. The x-axis there is what's being calculated by the twin. Now, what this data represents is the concentration in solution for a particular element throughout a wash circuit. So those that are familiar, it's actually a CCD circuit. So the top end is the more concentrated end, which is there, and that's the tail end. Now, each of the different colours represents a different location for a sample. And this is over time. So you're getting lots and lots of samples on I think they're a 2-hourly basis or a 4-hourly basis. I can't quite remember. So what you can see here is, if I talk about this top section first, is the measured analysis of the solution concentrations is actually matching the calculated. So that line through the middle is actually the one-to-one line. So what you can see is, although there is variance, there's no bias. And that's the important thing. And because you have the digital twin, you can actually quantify the variance of each of those given samples. Now let's exclude pink for a second, because that's the last part of this, because there's obvious bias there, and talk about these tail samples. Now the thing you notice about the tail samples is they also are on the one-to-one line mostly. Now, if you take a look at this section here, that's actually where the lab is actually reporting high concentration data, but the model is not actually reflecting that. So you can see that the modelled or calculated results are much less. That's because I didn't plot corrections. Notice how only high concentrations are corrected. Nobody ever corrects a tails grade up. Now let's talk about this middle section. So this middle section represents a sample point within the circuit. And what you can actually see here is what the lab is measuring is actually much more dilute than what the digital twin is calculating. That's an obvious mistake there, so that stands out. But these ones here, so you can see the bias is towards the calculated result. Now, there's only one way to explain this, and that is there is unmetered water going into that circuit. Now, the problem with that is this is a hydraulically limited circuit. So any water you put in, not into your wash stream or at the very back, is actually impacting your overall efficiency of the operation. It's actually quite bad, and it would go to a lot of effort to stop this from happening. For example, if this was my plant, I would have padlocks on a lot of these valves. When we raised this with the site, and you can see it had been happening for some time, what we said is it looks like there is water entering the circuit, but we don't know where. And the site responds back, no, we wouldn't do that, that's madness. So we're like, okay, take a photo of each of the underflow assemblies of each of those pumps and send us the photo for CCDs 1 through to 3. They got back to us an hour later and said someone had installed a 400 mil water line into the base of one of the CCDs, which was unmetered. Now, the reason they had done it is because they were trying to achieve a really high density in these upper to improve wash efficiency. But what that did is it actually caused the thickener to bog. So what someone had done is to get around that is install a big water line to actually flush it back out and make sure that it didn't stop. So it was one of those things where someone was trying to do the right thing, but then did something quite counterproductive, which annulled the whole concept. So that's just an example of how you can use context from a digital twin to actually work. And now we have systems with millions and millions and millions of data points, but that's an easy way to look at it. Okay, some case studies. Before I talk about the case studies, I think we just have to address, unfortunately, some of these need to remain anonymous, and the reasons for this will be obvious shortly. This is one of the biggest issues we have as a technology provider that, in essence, provides a governance platform. So let me give you an example of this. So a great client of ours gave an industry presentation and was asked a question following the presentation by someone in the audience, and they said, what is the best way to have our technology considered by your organisation? The response was swift and direct. Come to us with case studies. So simple, right? Okay, so me being me, I turned up the next day and said, here's my 5 case studies that I'd like approved. The response, we cannot provide authorisation to release our company name with any of these case studies as it could embarrass other departments or create a compliance issue for us. So lucky for us, our clients have always advocated our work and provided references, even if it isn't via a case study. Without this, we'd really be restricted in our ability to develop the technology. So the benefits of going digital are so far-reaching, and I could probably talk to you all day about lots and lots of case studies. But what I've decided to do is try and limit the case studies to one topic, and that's resource stewardship and governance. So this first case refers to a concentrator. So due to significant discrepancies between the mill-mine reconciliation values, which were often out to by about 15%, the company launched an investigation into the variances. It engaged sampling consultants from around the globe, which spent time on site to investigate the issue. The investigation lasted about 6 months, and I wasn't privy to the total number of hours spent and the associated costs. But I would say it's at least 2 million, probably a lot more if you factor in all the team's time. The outcome of the initial investigation was that the in-plant samplers were poorly designed and should be replaced. Okay, so this represented a major project that would have cost way over $10 million, and that's before we even considered the downtime of the plant. Okay, so we were asked to review the outcomes of these studies because we had our metallurgical intelligence software installed at this site for some time. So we literally had millions and millions of data points. It took us 2 days to categorically disprove the poorly designed sampler theory. By cross-referencing every assay and all major instruments, and then comparing it against production values, it became very, very clear that either everything in the plant was wrong by the same amount, and in some cases the bias was opposite, or there was something wrong with the mine values. So this triggered a review of the block model, and it was discovered that the grade control drilling had just been allocated incorrectly. This finding prevented a major project from going ahead and in fact reinforced the reputation of a sampler supplier. The outcome was the mine wasn't being depleted as fast as they thought, and no additional money had to be spent. Case 2. This is another mill mine reconciliation problem. So as part of an initial review of an operation, we had a meeting with senior site management who actually indicated that they were losing sleep over their discrepancies between the mill mine. The current value showed that the mine was supplying more than 10% more copper than was being declared at the plant. Sound familiar? So the first place we looked was the meta-counting spreadsheets. So why Excel is still being used is baffling, but we'll save that for another day. So the one thing we noticed straight away is the plant with moderate complexity was using a single shift assay for feed, tails and product to determine this performance. Now this was a big plant with a world-class lab facility. So the next thing we asked for was a sample matrix. So the sample matrix is a list of all the sample points and the intervals in which the samples are taken and what they're analysed for. So what you find out very quickly is there are 2-hour samples for every major process stream in the whole plant. So this is a massive amount of data. So the next logical thing to do was to look at the samples that made up the tail sample. It was made up of a number of different samples. So this is what you can see on your diagram now. So the first thing you notice is the combined samples, which is that blue line, is actually always much lower than the samples that make it together. So this was a big red flag. And this took half a day to figure out. So the next thing we did was go to the lab. So we got a full tour of the lab, which was literally a world-class facility with world-class instrumentations, practices, procedures, matrices, the works. It was really good. So at the end of the tour, the question was simple. If the tail samples and the samples that make up all up are tested the same way in the same equipment with the same procedures, then why is the tail sample always lower than the ones that make it up? Our chaperone excused themselves and returned 30 seconds later with the lab manager. The story was simple. They were under a lot of pressure to ensure that that value was low. So the interesting part of this case, though, is nobody was happy about it. Everyone was losing sleep over it. The pressure was on everyone at every different level, but it was actually very difficult to work out where that pressure was coming from, and was it just a historical hangover from somewhere? You couldn't figure it out. But this is the problem when you don't have governance systems in place. Governance systems empower people so that these types of things can be overcome easily. Okay, now I have one on the record. So this is the third case study is actually public domain, so you can look this up on the net, and I can provide the link if needed. But what happened last year is the Ontario Securities Commission came to a settlement agreement with Katanga Mining. Now, this was actually covered, all related back to a breakdown in their internal financial controls. So this is a quick rundown of what it is, but I'll just run you through it. So Katanga admits that between 2012 and 2017, it failed to maintain adequate internal controls over financial reporting. Now, what happened was they actually overstated copper production by $41.8 million and incorrectly capitalised $122 million worth of inventory. To be honest, this isn't an unusual case from what I see as an auditor. So the total penalties with this case actually came to a total of $34.4 million. And 7 of their current and former directors were banned and fined. And I've actually listed the fines and bans that went to each of the directors. So as you can see, there are organisations out there which are starting to take compliance seriously, and we need to actually have appropriate governance systems in place. So the mining industry as a whole has the combined intellectual capability that very few industries could ever dream of having access to. But to make effective use of that capability, we need to ensure we're transferring our data into accurate information. Otherwise, we risk making decisions based on poor information and perpetuating poor practices. In order to avoid that, we just need to decide whether we're brave enough to take that red pill and go forward. Thank you.